Okay. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. We are joined by Daniel Xie. Did I say your name correctly, Daniel?
Yes.
Daniel Xie, who is a contributor and an associate editor of the Canada Files. And we're doing this interview not only in the hopes that more people donate to the Canada Files Drive, but Daniel contributed to two very interesting articles, and we're going to get into them now because time is of the essence. So, Daniel, first of all, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for pleasure to be on here.
Likewise. So Daniel, because time is very short, can you explain to us first this article which you worked on with Aidan, Jonah, who's been a frequent guest on the show, and William Dere. The title of the article is "Michael Korvik and Spavor are spies despite obfuscations of Canada's mainstream media." And this article, and explain what this article, because this article, you and your colleagues debunked the two Michaels who have been detained by the Chinese government as not these innocent Western tourists that got detained by the tyrannical Chinese government, but that no, the Chinese government arrested them because they were spies and they were doing nefarious work. So explain your article.
So my article notes basically reports that drawing from the Global Time report, Michael Spavor was sentenced to 11 years in prison after being convicted of espionage. The charge that was used against him was that he was basically taking photos of Chinese military equipment on multiple occasions and sending them to various people outside of China, such as one of them being Michael Korvik, whom has been convicted of coming to China to gather information tied to China's national security and wrote analytical reports to be sent to the ICG, which, despite what you may think, has no power to operate in China. So the judge has
that's the international
crisis group.
Yeah, exactly, the International Crisis Group.
So basically, the case of the Michael Korvik and Spavor is noted because the Chinese government has made it clear that whatever freedom for them is banks on the Canadian government making the right choice about Wanzhou. Yet rather than heeding the words of the Chinese government, all of the main political parties and the far right have condemned what the Chinese government has done. The only party that didn't condemn is the actually left-wing movements and parties, for instance, like the Communist Party of Canada, which I am a part of. And so basically, Meng Wanzhou, as we all know, was basically arrested against her will and against international law in order to fulfill US arrest warrants simply because she navigated supposedly sanctions placed on Iran. And what we discovered is that these people were actually responsible for spying. They are not, like, say, innocent tourists arrested by an autocratic government. The Chinese government's fears were actually justified. In a thread by Amy McPherson, she notes that the Conservatives and the NDP have both fermented misinformation about the two Michaels. And since the NDP claims to be on the left, is another big shameful moment for the NDP. And she notes that basically the two Michaels' behavior were very suspect. Focusing her thread on Michael Spavor, she notes that he was involved with Paid to exchanges, which he was the head of. It was a non-governmental tourist organization in North Korea that somehow circumvented sanctions being put on North Korea. And he basically used this to Now the media will just, if they talk about this, focus on like him facilitating visits of people like Dennis Rodman, as well as Trump and John Bolton to North Korea. But what he actually did was he had a house between the Chinese and North Korean borders where he used to basically take photographs of both of military hardware on both of the countries, as well as important infrastructure being put on the Belt and Road Initiative. And he's been delivering some of these pictures to Spavro, who is part of the International Crisis Group. The International Crisis Group, which was founded in 1995, is basically, it frames itself as working to prevent wars and maintain global stability. Yet it gets most of its funding from NATO, as well as and uses and it's basically a arm for fomenting global regime change. We, drawing on the reports of the Gray Zone, we noted that the ICG has done a massive whitewashing campaign for the jihadi Muhammad al-Julani, who is the founder of al-Nusra, and basically promoted him as the, which honestly gives me the vibes of in the 1980s when the US used the Mujahideen to overthrow the socialists in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And we're seeing the consequence of this policy coming back to roots with the US's own defeat of US's own imperialism by their own creations in Afghanistan. And not only did they basically participate in the modern version of what the US did in Afghanistan in the 1980s, they also are responsible for propping up the Tigray People's Liberation Force, which basically committed horrific atrocities against both their own citizens and against Ethiopians. They've used child soldiers, stolen US aid convoys, and pushed doctor propaganda films against the Ethiopian government. And a Medium article called Disinformation in Tigray, Manufacturing Consent for a Secessionist War, exposes the fact that the ICG has helped them manufacture propaganda in order to manufacture consent for the secessionist war of the Tigray People's Liberation Force. And so it's clear that the ICG is basically an arm of American foreign policy rather than an agent of global stability. So basically, like according to the ICG had regime change goals in North Korea, and they view China's compliance as necessary to get what they want. Basically, according to a New Left review, the ICG sought to basically use some sort of gumbo diplomacy, face negotiation strategy to pressure North Korea to abandon its nuclear program and basically or face invasion and they want basically China to be on board the crippling sanctions they want to push for North Korea. And basically like Kovic is actually part of this initiative. He's written extensively about how they need Chinese to cooperate with them against the North Koreans, and that Xi's attempts to basically further develop Chinese socialism and develop further internationalism between socialist countries like, say, North Korea is basically an obstacle to this goal. So it's clear that the ICG viewed something that mirrors how Western powers view the rise of China. They initially viewed China as a potential ally, helping them expand their hegemony in the East. But as China reasserted itself and basically revealed how much it's still committed to the idea of Marxism-Leninism, the US started to view them as the next boogeyman to saber battle. And this even goes before Trump to the pivot to Asia. This isn't something that Trump and Biden decided on a whim that, oh, we're going to diss on China China now. There was some, I feel some lingering doubt about China, even going back to Obama, which is why we had the pivot to Asia to gear up for the new Cold War. And basically, we see a similar shift with the ICG. They originally viewed China as a potential asset of imperialism, as China asserted itself more and more and demonstrated that it still adheres to Marxism-Leninism. They started viewing China as a liability, and this is something that's clear in Michael Kovic's writing. So just to take away is that Michael Kovic is involved with a regime change organization seeking to, I suppose, destabilize North Korea and potentially isolate China. The photos he taking of military hardware during parades and Belt and Road infrastructure, if they fall into the wrong hands, it could easily be used for nefarious purposes. So China actually, in our opinion, was justified in what they did. And Canadians should, rather than abide by this narrative, push the parties to call for freedom of Wanzhou and mend fences with China, especially since Huawei's being forced out of Canada and various other Chinese industries investing in Canada being forced out of Canada will basically destabilize not just, like, say, the internet because of the lack of 5G being isolated, but also many people will lose their jobs, and the xenophobia is just going to get worse. So the Canadian public should demand that the parties actually defending Wanzhou, like the communists, be allowed to speak in debate, be allowed to give a genuinely leftist foreign policy where the NDP has abandoned, and also basically push the government to have an independent foreign policy rather than one subservient to Canada's own imperialism or American imperialism.
Before we get to Colombia, a follow-up question I have to ask, because you said from the from the beginning that the Michaels were only detained as a response to the unjust jailing of Meng Wanzhou. But is it safe to say that even if she wasn't arbitrarily detained by the Canadian state and her life threatened with unjust jailing in the United States, extradition to the US, that the Chinese state would have still detained the two Michaels due to the fact that they were de facto acting as spies for the International Crisis Group and the Canadian deep state?
Yes, because as I said, the International Crisis Group is an arm of regime change for the US and the NATO, and I'd say that even without if Meng Wanzhou evaded capture, if the Canadian government was pressured to relent, the Michaels would still have been imprisoned. And I would also note that the depictions of how this trial was handled is extremely hypocritical, because no country ever, what's so uniquely wrong about how China treats people that are threatening state security? Even Canadian spy trials aren't transparent, but this, I feel, is not just the way this trial is projected, is not just because of the Canadian government's desire to use the Michaels as leverage, as a bargaining chip, but also because, like, they want to make China sound as sinister or as a boogeyman as possible. So they do this sort of over focus and this sort of projection in order to make the Chinese response to the espionage look, quote unquote, bad.
Then in that case, how optimistic? you know people in China and so forth, and I know that you can read the Chinese.
I can read Chinese. I can
Yeah,
speak, but I can't read.
exactly. Chinese, all the different media outlets in China. How optimistic or pessimistic are you then when it comes to the efforts to free Meng Wanzhou? Do you think do you have any sources that are saying that there's a possibility that a prisoner swap can be released, that Canada will not extradite Meng Wanzhou to the US, and then in response the Chinese will go, okay, we'll free the two Michaels, or
I'm
how
honestly
dire is
not
the
sure.
situation?
Honestly, I'm not so optimistic that Meng Wanzhou can be extradited because everyone in the Canadian government, the NDP, the far right of the People's Party, and the Conservatives, they've all lined behind this quote unquote red boogeyman narrative, which is just going to inflame more xenophobia and anti-Asian racism. And because they are marching in lockstep with the Second Cold War, they will need pressure on our side. We'll need pressure on our side, specifically the anti-war movement and the Communist Party, since the Social Democrats, minus a few figures, have largely abandoned that principle. So we'll need mobilization from the Chinese diaspora, the communists, and the anti-war movements that are genuinely concerned about, like, say, the Second Cold War, since there are a couple of them which unfortunately do take the social democratic view of things. So yeah, nothing will happen unless something I've learned from history, from everything from women getting the vote to actually making a dent in equality, to race and LGBTQ plus relations, is that nothing happens without a big fight. And we need to prepare for this fight to free Meng Wanzhou and to end our role in pushing forward the Second Cold War.
How much more time do I have with you, Daniel? Because I don't think we have enough time to talk about the other.
I think we can still talk about Colombia. It's
okay.
I can
okay.
go over this.
Okay.
So
well, then,
for the Colombia,
so in that case, yes, this is the article you worked on called "How Canadian Resources Companies and Our Foreign Ministry Drove Colombians Towards Mass Resistance to Violent Neoliberalism." Explain that article, and it's interesting because reading about it, it's almost very similar what's happening right now in Colombia to the uprisings in Chile against the unaffordable price of education and the terrible.
And that to the change of the constitution, which can see Chile finally abandon the vestiges of fascism and neoliberalism and hopefully create something new.
And reading your article and reading that article about Colombia, I see so many similarities between what's happening in Brazil, the people power movement against the fascist Bolsonaro, and of course what's happening in Canada with Black Lives Matter and the Indigenous Lives Matter movement merging to smash white supremacy and and the abolitionist movement against police brutality. So so explain your article about Colombia and Canada's role in the state of affairs.
Colombia has been, in April 2021, there were protests against the healthcare reforms that were enacted with response to COVID. These healthcare reforms are actually tax breaks that would massively empower corporations for overtaxing the impoverished and working class and the landless peasantry. And this has led to massive protests being supported by labor unions, student activists, and social movements representing marginalized populations like women, Indigenous, and Afro-Colombian communities. These protesters demanded an end to the tax reforms, and this was initially granted, but the protesters know that the government will just find another right-wing bullcrap, and they basically also called for the resignation of the current far-right democratic center government and the trial of Alvaro Uribe, the far-right former president, and various figures related to the Colombian war on the far-right side for crimes against humanity. They also put forth the method to fight corruption, inequality, and police brutality. So this led to some of the last year's strikes in the Colombia, and the response has been horrific by the Colombian government. Like, there have been multiple attempts of huge police brutality and outright rape, as well as 200 disappearances. Around 34 deaths, according to independent observers, may have occurred during the course of the ongoing protests. And on July 30, 2021, basically, it was reported by Amnesty International that the Colombian government was detaining and torturing prisoners, and their excessive force was being used in cities like Cali. And even more recently, there has been attempts to suppress the Prima Limna protest collective over their role in anti-government demonstrations and their protection of protesters from police brutality. And what I've discovered for the Canada files from my talk with Pablo Vianco was that, not just my talk with Pablo Vianco, a Colombian who's a journalist for Telesur. Yeah, Pablo Vianco, a former journalist for Telesur, as well as a friend of a friend, a partner of a friend, whom I'm going to keep their identity undisclosed, to protect. A partner of a friend I know who basically stated that there are two major, that this is a continuation of systemic inequalities. But just I get from talking with them is that this is a continuation of systemic inequalities that has existed in Colombia, horrible systemic inequalities. Like in Colombia, 81% of land is owned by a small landholding elite, which is tied to the Colombian far right. And this inequitable distribution of land has led to the original uprising by FARC in the 1960s, which has only ended in 2016. Even with the end of the conflict, the far right had tried to make sure nothing ever changes. No grievance that spurred on the decades-long conflict is heard. When the original peace treaty was being produced between FARC and the Colombian centrist liberal president Juan Manuel Santos, there was a brief glimmer of hope because there was some open potential for some social change. The peace treaty, it explicitly managed protecting LGBTIQ people, Afro-Colombians, women, and a lot of marginalized indigenous Colombians. And basically, the far right was fuming, and they fuming that even a small bit of change that could dent the system could be made, and they basically launched a massive fear-mongering campaign. Because the narrative, sorry to interrupt, because the narrative that we get in the West, even those of us who consume left-leaning outlets, is that the root of all evil is FARC. Kidnappings only FARC does, war crimes only FARC does, and then there's just the occasional narco terrorists like. Despite the fact that even human rights organizations with problematic views of say the enemies of American imperialism, like Amnesty International, they themselves have said that 80% of the violence is caused by the far right and the paramilitary allies. So the small potential for social change, that was enough to piss off the far right, and they basically, to put it this way, they went full on Jordan Peterson or /People's Party /Rep Party, and when this is an attempt to basically create a gender ideology and turn Colombia into Venezuela. And as a result of their massive fear-mongering, what happened was that what happened was that the original referendums provisions, many of them were defeated, and they were really watered down. A lot of the protections for marginalized groups, they were made as vague as possible so the far right and the paramilitary can continue to get away with political murders, with about 1,000 social movement leaders being killed since all of this ended, as well as the fact that it made sure that any sort of political funding given by parties tied to FARC will be severely cut to make sure that they never organize electorally. And they made sure that any land in the conflict zone still belongs to the landholders. And all of this repression is made possible because of our complicity and our assistance. Remember those APCs I talked about? You remember about in the article? They were basically designed in Barrie, Ontario by the Incas company. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. Like the Colombian government, the Harper government has allowed the Uribe government to basically buy assault weapons with less restrictions in 2013, just 13, despite the protests of various human rights organizations. The Colombian government has bought APCs from the Canadian affiliate of General Dynamics Land Systems for the purpose of basically saber rattle against leftist governments like Venezuela, and even in the 1990s under Chrétien and maybe Mulroney,
Yeah, Mulroney.
And the Canadian government was busy shipping helicopters first to the US so they could reach the Colombian state to be used by security forces against FARC. And guess who trains these security forces and the paramilitaries? It's the RCMP and the Canada Border Security Agency through the Anti-Crime Capacity Building Program. And why do we do all this stuff? Why do we hypocritically demonize leftist leaders in Latin America, like say Maduro, Chavez, or Morales, or Castro, or Ortega, while upholding these far-right figures? It's because these far-right figures provide a good economic incentive for Canadian companies. Canadian mining companies and Canadian oil companies have, through the intervention of the Canadian government, expanded in Colombia, with the Canadian government basically writing laws for Colombia that says 40% of the land can easily be exploited by our companies. And this basically only worsens the cycle of violence, with indigenous and Afro-Colombians protesting these possessions being forcibly repressed, and in some cases have their homes and livelihoods destroyed, while the Canadian corporations employ security forces and paramilitaries in order to enforce their claims on the land. And so basically, it's clear that this sort of our Canadian imperialism, which, as I've done this research, is a clear extension of our own settler colonialism and white supremacy applied in a global context. It's complicit in the violence in Colombia. The blood of many Colombians are on Canadian hands, and this is yet another reason why we need to bring foreign policy imperialism to the forefront. And I think something that's important taking away from both of this is to bring foreign policy to the forefront. And if the NDP remains immune to all of this pressure, then it's high time for the communists and the anti-war movements and the various left-wing social organizations, the diasporic Latin American, of which Colombian is one of the biggest, and if we're mentioning Wanzhou to Michael's, the diasporic Chinese people to come to the forefront. We need to mobilize all hands on deck for this fight to bring foreign policy to the forefront. And I hope that this is something I can impart to your viewers today.
Well, Daniel, that was actually going to be my last follow-up question. That those in Canada who have been at the forefront with the anti-colonial movement led by Indigenous people and the eco-socialist movement led by Indigenous people, those part of the Black Lives Matter movement in Canada, and and of course those two groups are now merging. What needs to happen now with that is the peace movement needs to be connected to that, and all of those people who are protesting against settler colonialism, white supremacy in Canada, and the unjust system of capitalism, they have to understand that this is not an isolated case. Canada is not a force for good in the world, and what you just demonstrated with Colombia, their issues are Canadian issues. Canada propping up Bolsonaro, that is connected to the injustice at home. And if we want to also solve big issues like climate change and stuff like that, we need to have détente with China. And you cannot be an environmentalist, let alone an eco-socialist, and support any kind of militarism, imperialism, which is what Canada, the US, the EU, and so forth, NATO is trying to do with the efforts to balkanize China and support reactionary Uyghur separatists
in Latin America
and Hong Kong as well, right?
Mm-hmm. So basically, I think something that's important is that we need to have like a link between like the various anti-imperialist forces and the various, not just the various like Black Lives Matter, the various eco-socialist and indigenous self-determination movements, but to link them with like, say, the peace movement, the communist movement, and the people from these countries being targeted that can give a better image of how things actually are going. Because like from something that I've seen, seeing the discourse around imperialism and anti-imperialism, is that connections between like movements matter. Like I've seen problematic organizations like the DSA take a much less problematic position on Latin America due to the work of the international committee in actually trying to build ties with Latin American leftists. Yeah. This culminated in basically the last convention of the DSA in August of 2021 that basically saw actual anti-imperialist forces win out against those more like quote unquote third campus or anarchist forces in seeking to align with the Latin American left. And my hope is that this actually leads to a shift away from the of the DSA, away from aligning with American politics under the basis of neither X or Y, and actually into anti-imperialism. And we've seen the similar thing with like Progressive International. They've originally aligned with like, say, a lot of groups with problematic takes on Hong Kong and Taiwan, but through the work of, like, say, the Chow Collective, Vijay Prashad, they've actually shifted to a much more neutral position. So I think there is a need to basically unite everything that can be united in order to build something that can develop a broader understanding of the world and the concepts of anti-imperialism, rather than succumb to the same discourse being propped out by the Canadian American media and political establishment.
Well, I think that's I don't want to keep you longer because I know that you have another appointment to do so, but anywho, Daniel, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
So we are joined on this edition of 1+1 with Daniel Xie, who is a associate editor and contributor to the Canada Files. I'm just going to read out very quickly the two articles that people need to check out. How Canadian resource companies and our foreign ministry drove Colombians towards mass resistance to violent neoliberalism. And the article he contributed to, with William Dere and Aidan Jonah, is Michael Korvig and Spavor are spies, despite obfuscations of Canada's mainstream media. The Canada Files is currently doing a fundraising drive. Audiences, please donate generously if you can to the fundraising drive, and share widely this video and all other videos related to my interviews with Aidan Jonah. Check out the links, and yes, and it's up to the people power movements in Canada. They have to understand that you cannot fight against settler colonialism and capitalism at home and, you know, stay silent or avoid Canada's imperial role in the world. And evil did not start under Stephen Harper and Justin Trudeau. Canada's always been a partner in crime to the Anglo-American empires. So, Daniel, thank you.
Thank you for the time.
You're welcome, Daniel, and best of luck to the fundraising campaign. All right.
Much appreciated. Best of luck to you as well. Bye.